There is a kind of silence that only exists in a room where everyone has decided, together, without a single word passed between them, to let something terrible happen. Josephine Calder knew that silence the way she knew the sound of her own heartbeat. She was on her knees on the floor of a saloon called the Gilded Ox, blood running warm down her chin, and 40 feet away a lawman was pretending very hard that his whiskey glass was the most interesting object in the territory. What happened in the next 10 minutes would be spoken about in Rustwater for the rest of that century, but nobody in that room, not the girl bleeding on the floorboards, not the man with his boot on her shoulder, not even the stranger sitting quiet in the corner with his hat pulled low, knew that yet. Josephine Calder was 24 years old, and she had ridden into Rustwater that afternoon for one reason only. Her father's ranch was drowning in debt owed to a cattle baron named Elias Draven, and she had come to town to sell the one thing she had left that was worth anything, a hand-tooled saddle her father had made before his hands gave out from age and grief. She had not come looking for trouble. She had walked into the Gilded Ox because that was where Draven's men did their business, loud and public and unashamed, and she had made the mistake of watching one of them, a broad-shouldered enforcer named Cole Marsh, deal a card off the bottom of the deck to a rancher 3 times his age who could not afford to lose another dollar. She said so, out loud, in front of the whole room. That single sentence was the spark. Everything after it was the fire. Marsh did not argue with her. Men like Marsh rarely argue. They simply decide that a woman's voice is an inconvenience to be removed, and Marsh removed it the only way he knew how, with the flat of his boot against her shoulder, driving her down onto the sticky planks while the room around them erupted into laughter that sounded less like amusement and more like a pack of dogs that had finally been given permission. She tried to rise. He put her back down. She tried again, and this time he pressed his heel harder, and somewhere behind the bar the saloon keeper, a soft, careful man named Amos Teller, kept polishing the same glass over and over as if the friction of the cloth could somehow erase what his eyes were seeing. When Josephine called his name, he told her, without looking up, that his establishment did not take sides. She asked him what side there was to take between a man's boot and a woman's spine. He had no answer for that. He only kept polishing. It was the sheriff's silence, though, that cut deepest, because a sheriff's silence is not the same as a stranger's. A stranger owes you nothing. A sworn lawman owes you everything, and Sheriff Wyatt Combs stood at the end of that bar with his badge turned just slightly out of the lamplight, as though even the tin itself was ashamed to catch the glow. When Josephine called his name a second time, he told her, quiet enough that only the men closest to him could hear it clean, that maybe a saloon full of Draven's men was not the wisest place for a woman to go making accusations alone. It was not concern in his voice. It was permission, handed to every man in that room, dressed up to sound like caution. And that was the moment Josephine understood something that would change the rest of her life. In Rustwater, justice did not belong to the law. It belonged to whoever owned the most cattle and could afford to buy the silence of everyone standing around them. Cole Marsh, feeling the room lean in his favor now, decided to make an example of her. He called for 2 more men to come hold her down, promising, in a voice thick with whiskey and cruelty, to teach the rancher's daughter some manners her dead father had apparently failed to teach her. It was in that exact breath, in that exact rotten silence, that a stool scraped once against the floorboards at the far end of the bar, quiet, unhurried, almost gentle, the way a door closes when there is no wind left to slam it. Josephine, cheeks still pressed to the filthy planks, turned her head toward the sound without knowing why, and that was the first time she laid eyes on the man who was about to burn his name into the memory of an entire town. He was tall in the way old fence posts are tall, worn smooth by weather rather than built for show. A pale scar ran from beneath his left ear down into the collar of a coat the color of dust that had been rained on and left to dry in the sun 100 times over. He was not young. He was not the kind of handsome that turned heads in daylight. He had the particular stillness of a man who had already survived the worst thing that was ever going to happen to him, and had simply kept walking afterward because there had been nowhere else to go. He set his glass on the bar, unfinished, and said one sentence to Amos Teller, quiet enough that the room had to lean in to catch it, and loud enough that every man near the bar heard the warning folded inside it anyway. "That woman asked you twice. The stranger's name was Ezra Colt, though it would take the room several long, breathless seconds to remember why that name mattered, and by the time it did, Cole Marsh's boot was already lifting off Josephine's shoulder, and the whole shape of the evening had begun to turn, slow and inevitable as a wagon will finding a downhill grade, toward a reckoning that Elias Draven, safe in his ranch house 3 miles outside of town, did not yet know was coming for him. Ezra crossed that saloon floor the way a man crosses land he already owns, unhurried, unbothered by an audience of 10. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He told Marsh he had 3 seconds to step off the woman, and 3 more after that to decide what kind of man he wanted to be remembered as. Marsh laughed at first, the way men laugh when they have not yet understood what is standing in front of them, and he demanded to know who in the world thought he could speak to a Draven man that way. Ezra told him his name plainly, without weight, without threat, and it was 2 gray-bearded drovers at the back of the room who reacted first, straightening off the bar rail like men who had just heard a name out of an old, dangerous story they had hoped never to hear again in the flesh. Sheriff Combs set his glass down without finishing it. His hand drifted away from it entirely, as though it had forgotten, quite suddenly, what a badge was supposed to be for. Marsh's boot came off her shoulder on the count of 1. Josephine did not wait to be helped up, and there was no hand offered to her regardless, not from Ezra, not from a single other soul in that room. She planted her palms in the filth and rose to her own feet by her own strength, because some debts, she understood even then, were more dangerous to accept than to refuse, and being pulled upright by a stranger in front of 10 men who had just watched her beaten would have cost her something she was not willing to spend. When she was standing, she did not thank him. She did not know, in that moment, how. She turned instead to the room itself, to Marsh, to Teller, to the sheriff whose badge still hung crooked in the lamplight, and she promised them, in a voice that shook only at the very last word, that every man who had laughed that night would remember it for the rest of his natural life, because her father had raised her to write things down, and she intended to write down every single name. She walked the length of that saloon on legs that did not fully believe they could carry her, past a saloon keeper who would not meet her eyes, past a sheriff who cleared his throat and found, in the end, that he had nothing worth saying, past a young cattle hand who removed his hat for her without being asked, as though she were a woman leaving church rather than a woman leaving a beating. At the door she stopped, without turning around, and told Ezra Colt plainly that she had not asked for his help and did not care to owe any man a debt for it. He answered her just as plainly. She was not in his debt. A man did not get to claim ownership over a woman's gratitude simply for doing what every soul in that room should have done for her without being asked, 10 minutes sooner than he had. She rode home alone under a sky gone the color of a healing bruise, purple bleeding into black, and twice along that road she had to stop the horse and sit in the dirt until her hands stopped shaking enough to hold the reins again. She did not cry. Her father had taught her that tears were a currency, and she was not yet ready to spend hers on men who had not earned them. When she finally reached the gate of Calder Ranch, the moon high and full and indifferent above her, a young ranch hand named Tobias Reed was waiting on the fence rail with a rifle across his knees, and the look on his face told her he already knew, somehow, that the night had gone wrong long before she said a single word to explain it. What Josephine Calder did not know, riding home with her split lip and her torn sleeve and her mother's silver locket still hidden safe in the lining of her skirt, was that Ezra Colt had not come to Rustwater by accident, and that the debt she refused to owe him was about to become the least complicated thing standing between her family's ranch and the man who wanted it gone from the map entirely. Somewhere out past the ridge line, in a ranch house lit gold against the dark, Elias Draven was about to receive a telegram carrying a name he had hoped, for 11 long years, he would never have to hear again, and when he read it, his hand would not be steady enough to hold the paper still. If Josephine's story moved you tonight, hit subscribe so you never miss what Draven does next. Drop a comment telling me which town you're watching from, and if you believe justice should never bow to a man's cattle count, let me know below. See you in the next chapter of Rustwater.